used to listen to the Moody Blues all the time when I was a teenager, and I still remember all the words of so many of the songs. Like one of them was, "With the eyes of a child, you must come out and see." They're such simple words. With the eyes of a child, you must come out and see, which means that, like, to learn to have the openness, the sense of wonder and innocence of a child. And you know, when I contemplate these sorts of words, I think of Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, who immediately comes to mind as the embodiment of a man who was seeing in just such a childlike way. Though he well advanced in years. When I first saw him, he was 81 years old. In the famous PBS interviews in the 1980s with Bill Moyers, Mr. Campbell appears as the very antithesis of the cynical, close-hearted man whose capacity for transcendence has atrophied from attention. No, that was not the case with Mr. Campbell. For there you see on the screen a warm-hearted, warm-blooded man in love, in a state of love, an inspired man who, when he spoke about being spellbound and enchanted, he looked it. Here was a man who, in Colin Wilson's words, at the age of 1, was still dreaming to some purpose. It was so evident. It was palpable, powerful. My hope has been ever since, in some sense, to emulate Mr. Campbell's very evident, open-hearted expectancy. To possibly be open-hearted and full of wonder at the age of 81, I would think would be some kind of attainment. How might I, or any of us, remain in such an enchanted state? How might we stay in like a state of love? How might we remain inwardly alive enough to be full of wonder, full of love, and full of praise? Well, the answer is, I think, to cultivate a certain kind of awareness. I'll call it here a transcendental subjectivity, by which I mean a posture of stretching forth into transcendent dimensions. Such a stretching forth is to experience a constantly expanding sense of identity, the opposite, the very opposite of the impoverished mental state of the one-dimensional human being. It's to fulfill what some have said is the goal of life, which is to acquire or to attain the spirit. To be in such a state of love, it's to be in a state, to have a constant sense that there's always something more to stretch towards. There's more to behold. There's more to contemplate. There's more to fall in love with, which is therefore not to be bound too much in some ordinary sense of self, but to participate more fully in that larger sense of self that arises from moments of contemplation and from meditation practice. Now, an example of this stretching forth, this expansion of identity, is found in a novel written by Don DeLeo. It's called Falling Man, and it features a woman, among others. Her name is Lianne. She's the wife of a Twin Tower survivor, and she's trying to make sense of life as a Manhattanite in a post-9/11 traumatized world. Well, Lianne is a self-described infidel who wants to disbelieve in God, but interestingly, she has doubts about her doubts. So she doubts her unbelief. She's an unsettled unbeliever. Like, she can't quite relax into unbelief. And it's because something keeps happening to her. Though she's determined not to believe, welling up from her mind and soul are what she calls a sense that she has of dreaming towards something unreachable. Like, this dreaming keeps happening inside of her. Like Colin Wilson, she keeps dreaming to some purpose. So she remains hopeful against all hope. She's pulled towards some higher realm of meaning, doesn't know what it's all about, but she's pulled towards it. She keeps stretching forth to some as yet unrealized possibility of meaning and fulfillment. And she wonders if the very persistence of this desire points to it being a possible fact that a desire so strong actually means something. Does the persistence of the desire point toward there being, in her words, something there at the limits of matter and energy, a force responsible in some way for the very nature, the vibrancy of our lives? Does the presence of this desire point to transcendence? Does the persistence, the intensity of the desire, is it a signal that pointing towards actually the nature of ultimate reality and of a possible fulfillment? Is there, she asks, something there to be discovered from the mind out, from that mind that in little pigeon blinks extends the plane of being out beyond logic and intuition? Well, Lianne recalls that her father believed exactly that. He said, used to talk about it all the time, that there was indeed a realm of meaning beyond the limits of logic and intuition. Her architect father used to reason with his daughter, look around us, out there, up there, ocean, sky, night. Lianne's father believed that God infused time and space with pure being. He made stars give light. She'd think in response, that's crap, Dad. Night skies and divinely inspired stars, and so she'd scornfully answer back, a star makes its own light. The sun is a star. Case closed, conclusion, nothing to search for. The persisting desire about nothing, just something to be dismissed. Well, she couldn't live with that. And so on Sundays, this unbeliever had begun to take a taxi uptown weekdays, 2 or 3 times a week, to sit in a nearly empty church. She followed others when they stood and knelt, and she watched the priest celebrate the Mass, bread and wine, body and blood. And there she would sit, stuck with her doubts, but somehow liking to be there. She went early before Mass began to be alone for a while, to feel the calm that marks a presence outside the non-stop rifts of the waking mind. And there was one particular question that persisted. It was this: what if it's the case that the world itself, like all of it, the world itself, all of it, is meant to bring you to God? Like all of it, the beauty, the grief, the terror, the empty desert, the Bach cantatas, all of it meant to take you to God. Well, all of these varying forces seem to be closing in on Lianne, the unbeliever. Others, she said, bring you closer. Church brings you closer. The stained glass windows of a church, the pigments inherent in the glass, the metallic oxides fused onto the glass, God in clay and stone. So she'd feel these influences upon her, and then she'd react, I'm just babbling to myself to pass the time, and would then dismiss it all. So there's this inner conflict, like a longing, and then you shut the thing up. Well, after a while, Lianne came to realize that she was actually afraid to have an encounter with the divine. In fact, she dreaded it. She was afraid that God would decreate her and that she would be too small and tame to resist. She would fear being decreated, and yet she was understanding that it was just this kind of like deconstruction that would open up the way to the fulfillment that she was searching for. Now, this desire that she felt, like this has been described through the centuries in so many different ways, but often it's been described as a sense of eternity in the heart. It's a felt desire, and that in this woman's case, it would not go away. Now, various responses are possible. An atheist might say in response that there's nothing in that heart space. It's not really about anything. An agnostic might say, well, I'm just not sure about that. A humanist might, disallow the question even to arise. Well, my observation is that the negations of the atheist, of the agnostic, of the humanist, are refusals of the call, like they're not taking it seriously. These negations are examples of an inner warfare that is engaged against that inner drive that kept stirring in Lianne, this lady in Manhattan. As Father Henri puts it, in the heart of every man, there is something, like call it a drive, which is already there when he is born and will haunt him unremittingly until his last breath. And if that call of the heart is refused, there will be various consequences. And we see that all around us. Refuse the call and there will be, what about this? There will be, because I don't find that inner fulfillment, then I end up getting caught up and bound by the pursuit of fun. Life gets trivialized into mere fun seeking. Life gets reduced to the pursuit of fun. You hear this from people all the time. Are we having fun? Where can we have fun? I hope you had fun on your trip. That was fun. Let's do that again. That was fun. Well, behind, I think, the obsession with fun in our culture is an inner lack, an inner emptiness, and what it is a refusal of the call. A second possible refusal of the call is to fall into the view that life is harsh. I mean, you can trivialize life in response because of the absence of inner fulfillment, or you can just fall into feeling like life is just harsh. And since it's harsh, the best you can do, all you can do is just grab as much power as you can get. And so what happens is a human being remains empty, but becomes outwardly, externally powerful. Like, so what, big deal, but that's the route he's taken. How many people have fallen into that trap? The cases abound. A third possible consequence of refusing the call is to end up with the view that, well, life is absurd. Like, you can't even have meaning. It's not even possible. All of these things that I mentioned, these consequences of refusals of the call, are negations of the self, and they're negations of God. As in the case of the chief skeptic, the father of skepticism in modern time is the philosopher David Hume. For what clearly can be seen, according to philosopher Jacob Needleman, is that Hume gave up the search too soon. Like, in a sense, you could say that he, as well, Hume, refused the call. Dr. Needleman points out the failure of anyone to ask about David Hume's method of investigation. How did he look? Professor Needleman asks. What precisely was his method of inner observation? How long did he sit focused on his inner universe? Needleman's assessment is that Hume failed to engage in the discipline of what he calls inner empiricism. To Western minds, says Needleman, accustomed only to flights of intellect and the incessant dance of thoughts, Hume was some kind of hero. But to a Vipassana yoga teacher or to a Zen master, Mr. Hume's search was superficial. Like, he just had not gone far enough. He'd only dipped his toes into the water. The practitioners of deep meditation would have challenged somebody like a David Hume to stay with the process for another, 2 years maybe. Or how about 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years? And you'll see a lot more. And even then, there will be a lot more that you have yet to see. Concludes Needleman, Hume appears to have been completely unaware that he was stepping onto the very bottom rung of a giant ladder of self-observation. Like, he'd only stepped onto the bottom rung. And therefore, if we'd rather not be like that, rather not be stuck in atheism, agnosticism, humanism, or skepticism, if we would rather answer the call, our inquiry needs to continue and to deepen. In my experience, when I'm feeling empty or I feel sort of inwardly disconnected, I sit for meditation, like for a few minutes before bedtime. Sometimes my experience is that I quickly relax into a transcendent state. I'm amazed at sometimes how easy it is to get to that place. Other times, I'll admit, all I feel is my own restlessness. But there's always a payoff for the attempt to enter the stillness. Following that effort, however small that effort might be, I almost inevitably wake up in the early morning with a longing to meditate. And it's that longing that carries me to the meditation cushion. That little dip before bedtime makes all the difference. And I think that these little steps have a cumulative effect. Take enough steps, and the next thing you know, you'll be experiencing what Bernard Longergan calls the sweet adventure. For we are indeed human beings whose nature is a wellspring of desire that's meant to lead to a certain kind of fulfillment. In Longergan's words, we are body spirits. This is our nature. This is human nature. We are body spirits, and the energies of desire permeate our being. A little attention to the presence of that ever-beckoning, built-in desire will go a long way to enabling the ability to stay enchanted, to stay in a state of innocence and wonder, and to stay dreaming to some purpose.